Futures trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Everag Insights. And Steve, we're here in London this week, very early in the morning, to run through an agenda here. A bit of an update on US trade, update, ironically, on Australia from all the way over here. Obviously, a bit of the GDT lead into event number 355, the GDT, and of course, chart of the week.
Yeah, a long time to wait for that one today.
I know.
So kick us off, Joe, with a bit of a trade update from the US.
We have some data about March exports from the US, down 4% in milk solids equivalent terms. Skim milk powder was down 18% in March, and it's getting worse, and we'll have a little bit more to say about that later. Cheese was 21% higher, and mostly about Mexico, those gains in cheese shipments. WPC 80 still growing, and a big jump in MPCs, mostly Canada. But not much happening in butter there, Steve.
All the action on butter is on the import side. So those imports are still growing quite well, up 10% over the last year on year, just off an annual record, which was set in February. So it's just come down a little bit year on year because of that strong March last year. But, you know, imports, nearly 63,000 tonnes a year into the US, well, exports are down to 27,000. So it's really flipped around quite a bit. Strong internal market.
Yeah.
Joe, back home to Australia.
Back home to Australia. And milk was up 2.8% in March, and that's the southern regions mostly, were up 3%. Fresh milk regions, sort of New South Wales, Queensland, WA, up a little more than 1%. This is the 11th consecutive month of year-on-year increase in milk production in Australia, Steve. And while that sounds really impressive, we're only getting back to where we were in October 22 in moving annual total terms. So it's been a big recovery from, and you can see that dip through 2022, just recovering through 23 and 24, Steve, against those pretty awful comparatives.
And there'll be some muttering in the industry that this is still not the realistic set of numbers. They're small increases, but they're still, you know, talk to companies, they feel there's a lot more milk coming at them, but this is what the data says.
Well, speaking of that, what that translates to, and these are July to March export numbers, that production was up to May. While we've got season-to-date milk up 3.1%, we've got season-to-date exports up in milk solid equivalent terms 9%. Mostly it's a story about strong skim milk powder and cheese exports, Steve, especially the cheese into North Asia, which, you know, given the amount of competition out there, what our exporters have been able to do with that additional milk is pretty impressive, actually.
Yes. I mean, just to put into context, domestic demand is down a little bit.
Yep.
The cheese market's a bit softer. So that, you know, we certainly probably destocked. It isn't a straight comparison, you know, the exports to milk, but it does suggest there's a bit more milk around than what the numbers say.
Yes, quite possibly.
And again, looking at the import side, I'm a bit onto this, aren't I? So butter imports had a bit of a kick up in February and again in March. So, you know, we've gone after a lull, peak season lull in imports because of the greater volume of milk and cream available. But we're still down on a year ago, but maybe the slowing of the milk growth is starting to have some impact on the butter requirements.
Interesting.
So leading into the GDT event this time, looking at, you know, what's been the action colour in markets in the lead up. And the most dynamic space is in US cheddar, which has had a good rally, good short-term rally, as you can see there, that prices have lifted. It seems to be mostly about the supply side because there aren't too many good demand side stories coming up. Exports have been stronger, certainly in the March numbers as you've shown, but this rally's been going for a couple of weeks. Skim milk powder is going in the other direction in Oceania, drifted weaker on European sentiment, just that lack of demand coming through. In Europe, however, that's been held together. And then looking at in the butter market, the firmness in Europe is also a good story, mostly about the fact that it looks, you know, highly likely milk won't grow through the peak. It's going to be a bit later. There's tight cream supplies, and there's certainly warmer weather coming back. It's been a warm winter, but, you know, that the conditions are expected to warm up, and that's tightening cream supplies. Looking at GDT 355.
Yeah, well, the price index was up 1.8% overall. Pretty pleasing result. It's a little bit mixed when you look across the the board there, but fats have continued that really long rally. AMF has now been 17 events without declining, and we'll look into some of the reasons for that why a bit later, Steve. But cheese coming back into line.
Yeah, cheese has jumped. I mean, it's been all over the place, but it's jumped back in with a stronger US market. This is pretty lined up, and we'll see that towards the end. And we're looking at demand across the event as these indicators. This measures rounds 1 to 6 demand ratio. Pretty good again in whole milk powder. Skim milk powder dead flat. And the fats, as expected, staying strong because of the lower volume offering. The whole milk powder was up on higher volumes offered. So that's not a bad showing. We had 12% more tonnage available, and then with demand being up, that's probably some bullish result. When we look at who bought what from where, skim milk powder was very disappointing. China's involvement across the board was weak. In skim milk powder, this is the lowest volume purchase since 2011. So where did it get taken from? Southeast Asia came through on the same volume as the prior event, but European buyers picked up more than a third to pick up the rest. And we see growing volumes out of European sellers, which is helping that. But very disappointing for skim milk powder. And, that's a bearish indicator, we think, out of this event. We don't see too much coming back from the Asian part of the market. Whole milk powder, as I said, a little better. China, again, very poor buying. And look, new insights from the Chinese market, which we're not going to cover in this video because we've already got a lot, suggesting the internal market is a little bit more balanced. Well, that didn't show up here. Jo, what else is happening in whole milk powder?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Southeast Asia, a little bit better. Other regions have also increased though. So whole milk powder sold across regions, and we haven't seen that in quite a while. It's quite an even spread. So, pleasing for whole milk powder, I guess. The Middle East has lifted again, with prices still probably in a fairly attractive zone for them, Steve. Is it about the price?
So, Jo, good question. Look, I dragged this out, which just overlays the volume we just saw in the previous chart with the winning price on a contract too. And no, it's not about the price. Price is we say it's an attractive zone. It's been far better earlier, with a strong run-up in prices as we've seen in whole milk. 2 good rallies, and now we're into a small third one. The volumes have come back a bit as prices moved up. So it's an interesting relationship. I'm not sure that tells us too much.
Yeah.
Maybe it's about this one, Jo.
Yeah, that discount is still fairly substantial between the whole milk powder price and the synthetic price. And this is based on EU skim milk powder and New Zealand AMF. And that, again, it hasn't been as good as it was, but it's still pretty positive in terms of that discount, Steve. So, I guess still good buying for those Middle Eastern buyers.
Yep.
And then the fat premium, AMF is still good buying on a butterfat equivalent basis compared to the values of butter. And that may be behind this really strong sustained rally in AMF that we've seen for quite some time.
It'll end one day.
It will.
Okay, so where this takes us though, Jo, when you're looking across the commodities, New Zealand now the cheapest in skim milk powder compared to that European markets drifted, not gone very far. It actually looks quite good here. You compare that outcome, and futures now hugging the GDT forward price line. When we go to butter, this is quite a different story with the weakening expectations in Oceania. Not much traded in butter, but the GDT price is interesting. That forward line dipping quite strongly, downward dog, yoga position. The AMF curve looks very similar to this, but stable in other regions. So that might create some opportunities later for some exports into the Northern Hemisphere. And lastly, Jo, looking at cheese, and as we said, the GDT pulled up into line with where the US market's got to. So that's a pretty interesting comparison looking at where Europe is now. Okay, Jo, what is the chart of the week?
Yeah, for chart of the week, and we're sitting in Europe, but let's go across the other side of the Atlantic again and talk about US skim milk powder exports. And again, that March data coming out, there's a really profound dip in trade to Mexico, and you can see it in those dark blue lines there. Other regions not coming back in to compensate for that dip in Mexican demand. So that skim milk powder, non-fat dry milk story is not looking very positive, Steve, at all.
Wherever you look. Okay, well, that's all from us. Next week, we'll be in Amsterdam for the next 3 weeks, in fact. Thanks for watching. We'll be back next week.